Ever wondered what happens to a country's debt when, like, everything changes?
You mean like a new government comes in,
Yeah,
or
exactly. Like a whole new regime.
or like when borders shift around?
Right. Or a country just, like, straight up disappears off the map.
Haha. Yeah, that's a bit more extreme.
But it happens. And then what? Does all the debt just vanish into thin air? Someone's got to pay, right?
It's a really fascinating question, especially these days when things feel so internationally,
Totally. So to help us untangle this whole debt dilemma,
which is a pretty big one,
definitely, we're doing a deep dive today.
into the wild world of odious debt.
Odious debt. Okay, now that sounds...
Pretty loaded term, right?
Yeah, like something out of a spy thriller.
It kind of is. It's basically this idea that some national debts are so messed up.
Messed up how?
Like they're so against the interests of the people, or they were incurred in such a shady way
I'm starting to get a picture of this.
that they shouldn't automatically get dumped on a new government.
So, like, if a dictator takes out a bazillion-dollar loan to build a solid gold swimming pool,
Haha. Okay, maybe not that on the nose, but you're on the right track.
and then that dictator gets ousted by, let's say, a pro-democracy movement.
That debt for the gold-plated pool shouldn't automatically transfer over to the new government.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so how do we even begin to unpack this whole odious debt thing?
Well, luckily, we've got a legal heavyweight in our corner.
Oh, lay it on me.
His name is Alexander Sack,
Alexander Sack.
and he wrote this super important book back in 1927.
1927, so right after World War I. Talk about timely.
Exactly. The world was basically redrawing itself, right? So he had a front row seat to this whole debt trauma.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So Sack's book is called Get Ready for It. It's a mouthful. The effects of state transformations on their public debts and other financial obligations.
Wow, he really went there with that title.
Right. Straight to the point.
So did Sack basically say, listen up, debt follows the land, end of story?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that.
I figured as much.
But that is the gist of his argument. He says public debt isn't just about whoever's in power at any given moment.
It's like tied to the actual country itself.
Exactly. He actually compares it to how private citizens own property.
So, like, even if there's a revolution, your house is still, well, your house.
Exactly. New government, old government, your property rights usually stay put.
That makes sense. I never thought about it like that.
It's a powerful analogy. And Sack argues that new governments, they inherit the obligations of the old ones in the same way they inherit, like, all the cool stuff.
The national treasures, the historical landmarks.
Exactly. You take the good with the bad, right?
So where does this whole odious debt exception come in? Like, when does that inheritance get a little messy?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where things get really, really interesting. Sack says you can't just slap an odious label on any debt you don't like. You need proof.
For proof. Like, what are we talking? Receipts? Witnesses?
Okay, maybe not receipts, but definitely some solid evidence.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of evidence are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the purpose of the debt is huge EE.
Like what it was actually used for?
Yeah, was it used to benefit the state and its people?
Or was it, like we were talking about earlier, for something totally shady that only benefits a select few?
Exactly. Or even worse, something that actively harms the population.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely getting into odious territory.
And then there's the whole question of war debts.
Yeah, those are the big ones, especially back when Sack was writing.
For sure, and he actually spends a good chunk of his book analyzing war debts and how they were treated in various treaties, like the Treaty Versailles after World War I.
Oh man, the Treaty Versailles, that was a whole thing.
Right. And it gets right to the heart of this odious debt question, because you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was broken up into several new countries after the war.
And I'm guessing they got stuck with a hefty chunk of the old empire's debt.
You got it. And basically, they were told you can either honor these debts or face economic isolation.
So it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Either way, it's gonna hurt.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole concept so fascinating. Because it's not always about right and wrong, black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
And a lot at stake. So if a country does want to make the case that a debt is odious, what kind of evidence would they need? Did Sack lay out some rules for that? Did Sack lay out some rules for that?
Oh, absolutely. He gets into the nitty-gritty, which I love about him.
Give me the legal thriller version.
Okay, so picture this. You're a lender, right? And you know a government is using borrowed money for shady stuff.
Like straight up harming its own people shady.
Exactly. Sack argues if you can prove the lenders knew or should have known how the money was being used, well, They're not so innocent anymore.
It's like knowingly funding a supervillain's evil lair. Not cool.
Right. You're complicit.
Yeah,
And that makes it much harder to argue that the debt should be honored.
makes sense. What about those situations where, let's say, a government takes out huge loans, but the people never had a say?
Ah, the consent of the governed. That's another big one for Sack. He says if you can show that the people who are supposed to benefit from the debt never actually agreed to it,
That's a pretty big red flag,
it's
right?
huge. And it makes the odiousness argument even stronger.
Okay, I'm ready for a history lesson. Give me an example where this actually played out.
All right, let's talk about Poland. Post-World War I, things were pretty chaotic, right? Borders redrawn, new countries popping up.
Yeah, a recipe for a debt disaster.
Totally. And Poland, they had this unique situation with something called Kosciuszko notes.
Kosciuszko notes. Sounds kind of ominous already.
It kind of was. Basically, it was a type of currency issued during German occupation.
So Poland stuck with this German-backed currency, even though it was issued when they weren't exactly in charge. What a mess.
Total mess. So now the newly independent Poland has this big decision to make. Do they honor the German guarantee on these Kosciuszko notes?
Knowing these notes were basically a product of occupation, talk about a dilemma.
Exactly. And it perfectly illustrates why Sack's analysis is still so relevant today. Because it's rarely simple.
There's not always a clear good guy or bad guy.
Right. It's about navigating these gray areas, these messy historical realities. And that's where odious debt gets really interesting.
So how does any of this relate to us today? Most of us aren't exactly debating war debts from a century ago.
True, but here's the thing. Understanding this concept of odious debt gives us a whole new lens to view what's happening right now in international finance.
You mean like those headlines about countries drowning in debt?
Exactly. Think about it. We're in a world with massive loans being issued, often by wealthier nations to developing countries.
Right, for things like infrastructure projects, development initiatives.
Exactly. But what happens when those loans come with strings attached? What happens when the money doesn't actually benefit the people it's supposed to help?
And instead, it lines the pockets of corrupt officials.
Bingo. Or it funds projects that harm the environment or displace communities.
So these loans, they might look good on paper, but they're actually causing more harm than good.
And in those cases, that's when this whole odious debt idea comes into play.
Because the new government could argue that they shouldn't be on the hook for debts that were incurred by a previous regime that didn't actually represent the will of the people.
Exactly. It's about more than just money. It's about power, accountability, and who gets to decide a nation's future.
So instead of like a big warning label on a bottle of something that says, don't drink this, you'll regret it, we're talking about some kind of financial warning.
Exactly. I mean, Sachs was writing in the 1920s, right? So he was thinking about actual physical bonds and certificates.
Right, not exactly Bitcoin and NFTs.
Yeah. But his idea, it still holds up. Like imagine if those loan agreements, especially the ones with sky-high risks, they came with some kind of metadata, you know?
Metadata. You mean like embedded information that flags any red flags?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, hold up, this loan is looking a little sus. And not just for the financial experts. It should be clear to anyone looking at it.
So that everyday people, even governments, can see if something shady is going on.
Exactly. Transparency is key.
And is there any way to actually do that? Like, how do you build that kind of transparency into the global financial system?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because now, with things like blockchain technology,
Oh, right. Everyone's talking about blockchain these days.
and for good reason,
Yeah.
it could be a game changer for this kind of thing.
How so?
Think about it. We could literally create a public record of loans that's impossible to fake.
So every step, from who issued the loan to where the money actually ends up, it's all there on the blockchain for everyone to see.
Exactly. Complete transparency.
Yeah.
And that empowers citizens to hold their leaders accountable.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about making sure the money is actually being used for good.
Exactly. Imagine lenders having to think twice before approving a shady loan because they know the whole world will be watching their every move.
It's like that old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Exactly. And in this case, that sunlight could help prevent a whole lot of debt disasters down the road.
It's amazing to think that an idea from almost a century ago could have such a huge impact on the future of finance.
Right. Sack was onto something.
He really was. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating and often unsettling world of odious debt, I think the big takeaway here is that we all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
We can't just assume that every loan, every financial deal is on the up and up. We have to stay informed, ask tough questions, and hold our leaders accountable.
I completely agree. And who knows, maybe by having these conversations, by shining a light on these issues, we can help create a more just and equitable global financial system.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, it's time for us to sign off.
Until next time.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.